Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Let me declare open the session of the Dissertation Council for the Defense of Thesis by Kokhan Andrey Alekseevich for the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialization 070002 National History, on the theme Structure and Functioning of the German Propaganda in Crimea, 1941-1944. According to the order of St. Petersburg University, dated the 19th of December, 2019, me, Khodakov Mikhail Viktorovich, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, Head of Department of the Modern History of Russia of St. Petersburg University, was appointed Chairman of this Dissertation Council. Let me introduce my fellow Council members. Sergei Gennadievich Verygin, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Director of the Institute of History, Political and Social Sciences, Petrozavodsk State University. Kovalev Boris Nikolaevich, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, Leading Researcher, St. Petersburg Institute of History, Russian Academy of Sciences. Boris Nikolaevich is absent for a good reason today. Krinko Evgeny Fedorovich, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Chief Researcher, Federal Research Center, Southern Research Center, the Russian Academy of Sciences. Oleg Valentyevich Romenko, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, Department of Russian History, Crimean Federal University, and in the remote mode we have Timofeev Alekseevich, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Belgrade University, Serbia. Let me inform you that our session is being recorded, broadcast online at university's website. It's being simultaneously translated from Russian into English and from English into Russian. According to the federal law, the 23rd of August 1996, number 127 on science and the state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg University has the right to award academic degrees independently. Corresponding order on the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, on the basis of which we are holding this session of the Council, was issued on the 1st of September 2016. In accordance with the order, a session of the Dissertation Council is duly constituted if at least 2/3 of approved members of the Council are participating, but no less than 4 persons. Our Dissertation Council consists of 6 members. 5 members are present, including 1 member of the Council in the remote interactive mode. The audio-visual contact has been established with him, thus we have the quorum. Let me set forth the procedure of today's session of the Dissertation Council with a total duration of no more than 2 hours. First, Chairman's summary report on the main content of documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the regulations. Answers to possible questions, approximately 5 minutes. Second, brief presentation by the applicant outlining the key points of his study. Andrey Alekseevich, you have 15 minutes for that. 3, questions to the applicant strictly on his report, no more than 2 minutes per question. 4, answers of the applicant, no more than 5 minutes for all questions. 5, speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews in turn, with statements of their opinions, questions and suggestions to the applicant, no more than 10 minutes for each speaker. 6, speech of the chairman and his review, approximately 10 minutes. 7, answers of the applicant to questions and remarks made by members of the Dissertation Council, no more than 15 minutes. And 8, open discussion. Speeches of the attendees who are not members of the Dissertation Council with summaries of their positions or specific questions and suggestions to the applicant strictly on the topic of the study, no more than 5 minutes per person. For that, all the speakers are kindly requested to put their names on the registration sheet and introduce themselves in full before speaking. 9, Final answers of the applicant to questions asked. No more than 5 minutes. 10. Address of the academic supervisor. The applicant, no more than 3 minutes. Alexander Sergeyevich. You only have 3 minutes for speech. 11. A 5-minute discussion before the open voting on awarding or not awarding the St. Petersburg University academic degree to the applicant. For the time of this discussion of the council members, broadcasting shall be suspended. 12. Open individual voting and counting and results should be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. 13. A decision on awarding or not awarding the academic degree to the applicant. 14. Closing remarks of the applicant. No more than 2 minutes. Here is the procedure for today's session. Does anyone have questions regarding the procedure? I think everything is very clear. There shouldn't be any questions. Let's start. And let me remind you to switch off your mobile phones if anyone has not done so yet. Well, summary report of the chairman included in our agenda. The thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan for the degree of candidate of historical sciences, specialization 070002 national history, on the theme structure and functioning of the German propaganda in Crimea 1941-1944, was accepted for defense by the order of academic secretary of St. Petersburg University dated the 17th of December 2019. The dissertation council was appointed by the order of the academic secretary of St. Petersburg University on the 19th of December 2019. And I have already introduced its members to you, dear colleagues. Andrey Alekseevich started his thesis studying at the postgraduate course of Crimean Federal University in Universitetskaya and graduated already at St. Petersburg State University. Scientific supervisor, Doctor of Historical Professor, the Department of Modern History of Russia, Alexander Sergeyevich Pushenkov. A number of publications of the applicant which set out the main scientific results. According to the enclosed list is 3 scientific articles, all in peer-reviewed scientific journals from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science of Russian Federation. Thank you. Hopefully there will be no failures. Currently, the applicant works at the Federal State Budgetary Research Institution, Likachev Russian Research Institute for Cultural and Natural Heritage. The applicant submitted to the academic secretary of St. Petersburg University a full package of documents for consideration defense of the thesis. All documents comply to item 12, section 3 of the order. All documents are kept in the applicant's certification file, and copies are available from an employee of the Department of Support of Dissertation Councils, Khrushcheva, who oversees this defense by the administration. Any questions regarding documents to us or to the supervisor? If there are no questions, copies of the documents are available for the expert of the Dissertation Council Activity Support Department, who's present here. Andrey Alekseevich. I'd like to give the floor to you to outline the main points of your research, up to 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear guests. Let me briefly present the key points of my thesis. Let me start. The Crimean Peninsula was occupied by the German troops in November 1941. Yet administrative system of the temporary occupied territory is there is a number of reasons for that. First of all, close to the front line guerrilla movement in 1941-1944. Sevastopol was a real stronghold, and finally attacks which took in Fedosia and Eupatoria. Thus, in Crimean Peninsula, though formally it was a risk, the military department had to rely on the leadership, on the local population, and it was necessary to pay attention to strengthen your position in Crimean Peninsula. For that purpose, it was necessary to strengthen the economic constitution and exercise propaganda. That is why, since 1941, the temporary occupied territory of Crimea, the first bodies responsible for Nazi propaganda were established. Yet, we could not say that propaganda in Crimea was responsible only for one body. As a matter of fact, study of Nazi Germany ministries and party leaders resulted this propaganda issues and in Germany and temporary occupied lands. The number of systems and ministries was responsible. In Crimea, first of all, there was propaganda headquarters, road propaganda as a joint organization, unit propaganda, Ministry of Education propaganda, and Wehrmacht. In addition was Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Main propagandist here was Otto von Hendig. And in addition to that, Rosenberg headquarters is Crimean division, and local prefectures, field administrations responsible for maintaining order in occupied territories and propaganda to civilian population. Thus, purposes set study of the propaganda system in Crimea and the interaction, and following tasks to identify main propaganda bodies in Reich. In addition to that, it was necessary to define propaganda system of the military administration in Crimea and find forms and types of cooperation with local collaborations and peculiarities of propaganda bodies in 1941-1944. On the basis of which, the object of my study is propaganda bodies in Crimea, active 1941, and the subject of my study, functioning of the propaganda system at the temporary occupied territories of the Crimean Peninsula. Novelty of my study is identified peculiarities of formation, function, military administration, many stages, process of formation, propaganda bodies in Crimea during the occupation. For the first time, I tried to study system military propaganda in the occupied territory under conditions of interaction and counter-interaction between the various authorities, the reasons of political collaboration, the role of local population in forming the propaganda system in the region. The following provisions are put forward for defense. Third Reich system, propaganda system, covered all areas of German society and was to act as a link between German soldiers and civilian population in Germany. Because of importance of propaganda in the state, there was a struggle between a number of ministries to supervise propaganda activities, both within and outside the Reich in the occupied territories. Such confrontation between ministries over propaganda activities led to confrontation between bodies responsible for local propaganda. Same functions were assigned to propaganda headquarters, Rosenberg operational headquarters, in addition to removal of cultural properties from museums in the occupied regions to Nazi Germany, was also responsible for propaganda activities. It was not possible to carry out propaganda activities without involvement of various local bodies that were aware of the specific life in the region. Without political collaboration, it would have been impossible to operate both the administrative management system and the propaganda system in the Crimea. Despite the strict hierarchical system of subordination of the propaganda headquarters, on the one hand, and the commander-in-chief of the German troops in the Crimea on the other hand, there were frequent cases when propaganda was contrary to events actually taking place in the region or did not cover the most important activities of Wehrmacht in Crimea. Print propaganda, radio and film propaganda has been common in Crimea. However, due to the distance the local headquarters from the second headquarters of Crimea, gave and lack of skilled influence, Crimean authorities gave greatest influence to printed propaganda that could be distributed everywhere, increasing coverage of the territory where propaganda materials were distributed. However, Russian and Tatar language editions were not national newspapers published, but rather German propaganda materials published in Russian or Tatar languages. On the basis, the structure of my thesis consists of 3 chapters: introduction, conclusion, list of sources and literature. It's structured on thematic chronological principle. Such, speaking of chronology, 1941, 1944. Possible deviations starting with 1920s to 1950s. Such conditions necessary to trace motivation of the people who took part of the propaganda bodies from local population in the occupied areas, former white immigrants who entered Crimea together with the Nazi occupants, and chronological framework is necessary to trace life of people involved in propaganda activities and occupied. Geographical framework is Crimean Peninsula, was included in the general area of Ukraine. Administrative authority of Alfred Frauenfeld has never been established here. That is why Crimea can be considered separately, because a military administration was exercised here. As for the sources I used in my thesis, first of all, this is Central Archive of Russian Federation, Central Archive of Ukraine, Central National Supreme Administrative Authority, and security, regional archives in the Republic of Crimea, and special archives such as Archive of the Federal Security Service of Crimea and Sebastopol. So, National Archive Records, United States Holocaust Memory Museum. If we talk about contents of these cases started against people involved in propaganda activities, who were all local residents who stayed in occupied. These cases started against translators, reporters, members of editorial boards of the occupation publications, translators of SD, and members of Muslim committees. In addition to that, it's important from KGB, RSD, on mood of the population, reports on and post-war materials such as reports of Supreme State Commission and materials created by responsible bodies who investigated crimes during the Nazi occupation. When in 1933 Nazi came to power, it led to formation of new political structures, and a special place was given to propaganda, which is an integral part of both the administrative and party state system. The concept of future propaganda, formed by Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels, found support among the supreme commanders, which resulted in 2 agencies to organize propaganda, which took part in the upcoming war. Despite the strengthening of Goebbels' position, a number of other ministries, departments, and representatives claimed the leading role in organizing propaganda activities both in Germany and abroad. It was the ministerial race to increase powers led to formation of a complex propaganda system. which operated in the occupied territories and consisted of representatives of opposing ministries. In November 1941, German troops captured the territory of the Crimean Peninsula. From that time, they began to establish a new order in the region, which had to be ensured on the one hand by measures against local population disloyal to the new administration, and on the other hand by propaganda activities. Despite plans developed on the eve of the Nazi attack, according to which Crimea was to fall under jurisdiction of the Reichsminister of the occupied Eastern Territories, Alfred Rosenberg was civil administration had never been exercised, and during 1941-1944 the establishment of military control explained by slowdown of the German offense against Soviet Union since 1942, difficult military situation in the peninsula associated with the protected siege of Sebastopol, as well as landing on the eastern and western coast of Crimea, reinforced by partisan movement. Under these conditions, all the management functions received by commander of the 11th Manstein and management of the region was carried out jointly by General Staff of the Army and the Commandant's office in the area, which the established system of administration could not function without involving representatives of the local population. Rapid offense of the German troops in 1941 and seizure of the vast area of Soviet Union led to shortage of administrative staff, with occupation regime experienced until the end of the war. Thus, collaborators had to solve the problem of staff shortage. On the one hand, in order to secure the rear, the German command used services of civilians everywhere, an organization of local government at the rural level, and administrations of cities and districts. On the one hand, the German command tried to show its loyalty to the civilian population. On the other hand, created an illusion the occupied territories were governed directly by the inhabitants. Thus, since 1941, all spheres of government have been recruiting inhabitants of the peninsula who were active anti-Soviet and pro-German attitude. However, in order to ensure law and order in the territories occupied by the German troops, according to the concept proposed goals, in addition to the forceful influence and formation of pseudo-legitimate local government bodies, propaganda apparatus were formed. In zones of local governments, a part of city administrations consisted mainly of civilian population. However, because of the current system of military management in the Crimea from 1941 to 1944, all the propaganda activities were carried out by employees of propaganda companies. 649 propaganda company attached to the 11th Army was engaged in spiritual support of the Wehrmacht soldiers. The second platoon of the 695 company carried out the whole range of propaganda among the civilian population. November 1941, September 1942, companies had no branching system. Legally, they were under command of the Wehrmacht commander-in-chief in Crimea and chief of the general staff of the army. But in fact, all the work was carried out under the guidance of the intelligence department coordination with Abwehr officer. The lack of qualified propagandists and ongoing military clashes and the inaccessibility of many regions of the peninsula led to propaganda companies have started to carry out propaganda activities with the support of paramedics and terms of established they used for the purpose they used establishing districts, town, villages, directorates. The system of dissemination of propaganda materials became more complex because of the distance of Sebastopol and in the winter 1940 was a turning point and led to the distrust of the civilian population to German propagandist activities, which caused by famine, increased taxes, and mass extermination of civilian population of the peninsula. In January 1942, German troops carried out shooting of the Jewish population in Crimea. Growth of public discontent and spread of Soviet counter-propaganda, German propaganda apparatus was not able to control because of its small size. And to solve these issues, German punitive bodies were used, GFP and units of SD. In addition to identifying Jews and disloyal to the new other population and fighting the partisan movement, bodies took part responsibility of destroying Soviet leaflets and posters. However, if the number of printed materials of the enemy was reduced by the end of 1942, the spread of rumors that undermined the authority of the German command in the Crimea continued until the liberation of the peninsula in April-May 1944. In addition to propaganda companies, the German Ministry of Education Propaganda and the Wehrmacht propaganda section of which operated on the peninsula during 1941-1942. During the same period, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, headed by Ribbentrop, try to influence the propaganda. Long negotiations enabled the minister to introduce emissaries of the ministry as reference officers in the Weimar Otto von Hendig. In spring 1942, your time is up. How much more time do you need to finish your presentation? I'm finishing my presentation already. The complicated system of German propaganda in Crimea existed until 1944. At that, we may say that the greatest influence on propaganda activities as propaganda headquarters and Ministry of Foreign in Rosenberg headquarters that were removed from the Crimea in 1942. At that, it's necessary to remember that their functioning was impossible without the involvement of residents of Crimea. Thank you. That's all I have to say. Thank you, dear colleagues. You have questions to the applicant? Any questions to the applicant? Andrey Alekseevich, we have one common question. Could you please answer? In documents, I mentioned that you are the author of 3 publications on the subject of, on the theme of your study. Yes, reading, it seems that you have been working on this subject for a long time. First publication dates 2008, and totally you have 10 publications. I saw 10 articles devoted to this theme, and you only mentioned 3 here. What is the reason in this? Can you explain, please? Totally I have about 12 or 15, but I mentioned only 3 articles published in the last 2 or 3 years. So without Ukrainian and journals not included in the list, is there a requirement that only recent publications should be mentioned? Yes, I was told. I think that is incorrect. You should submit a complete list of your publication. Doesn't matter, Ukrainian or Chinese. Thank you. If no one has questions, please have a seat for the time being. And next comes reviews, including external. As I understand, no external reviews have been submitted. All the information was published at university website. That is why I suggest we start with the reviews, and we shall do it in the alphabetical order. As the colleagues are listed here about the procedure. Andrey Alekseevich, please have a seat, or do you have to remain standing? It's up to you, really. I would sit down if I were you. Let's give the floor to Sergei Gennadyevich Verygin for his review. Dear Chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear guests, let me present a review of Kokhan and Alekseevich thesis on structure and function of the German propaganda in Crimea 1941-1944. The thesis submitted for procurement of degree of candidate of historical sciences. The relevance of the topic of Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan's thesis is beyond any doubt. Recent objective assessment of events of the Great Patriotic War connected with the impact of German propaganda on the population of territories occupied during the Great Patriotic War remains one of the pressing problems of national historiography. Today, there is no generalized work on creation and function of the system of German propaganda in Crimea in 1941-1944. Insufficiently covered is the problem of involvement in the system of German propaganda of civilian population, as well as with the mechanism for conducting propaganda activities in the region during its occupation of 1941-1944. Relevance of the thesis is also explained by the fact that the author tried to solve an important methodological issue. to show that the effectiveness of the German occupation regime depended not only by the victories of the Nazi Germany, but also by loyalty of civilian population of Crimea. And this loyalty largely depended on effectiveness of the German propaganda system in the region. Scientific novelty and reliability of results of the thesis are determined first by a comprehensive study of the national and foreign historiography, second by the involvement of a wide source base, which is based on archival materials from 88 archives of 7 archives of Russia, Ukraine, USA and Germany. Many documents were first introduced by the author into scientific circulation, and thirdly, by a complex analysis of function in the German propaganda organs in the Crimea of 1941-1944. An overwhelming majority of sources used by the applicant when working on his thesis were created directly during the period under consideration have high reliability. These documents, much of which have been assigned high level of secrecy, were created with greatest possible objectivity as they were intended to develop the most adequate response to German propaganda due to the current situation of the Soviet-German front and in Crimea in 1941-1944. The structure of the work seems to be logical, and the compositional idea of introduction, topics of chapters, conclusions reflect all the key components of the declared theme and are key to solving the scientific problem and objectives set in the thesis. The first chapter covers issues of formation of the military management system in the Crimea, peculiarities of function and influence of military propaganda on maintaining morale of servicemen in the region. The author puts forward and substantiates the idea that due to failure of blitzkrieg German military propaganda was rebuilt and its functions were expanded to propaganda among the civilian population caught in the zone of occupation. The second chapter explores the system of German propaganda aimed at civilian population. The author emphasizes the importance of German military command in the Crimea as a problem of establishing relations with the intellectuals and the Soviet administrative system who remained in Crimea and were ready to cooperate with the Nazi regime. Of particular interest is the fourth section of the chapter, which describes the situation and activities of the German military, the role of newspaper Voice of Crimea. Chapter 3 is dedicated to analysis of German propaganda against the Tatar population. Significant role is given to the establishment of Muslim committees, which were recruiting volunteers in the Crimean Tatar battalions included in the Burma. The author emphasizes that thanks to the actions of the Muslim committees, German command was able to rescue its rear, focusing on military operations. Conclusions of Andrey and Alekseevich are both on chapters and in the conclusion of the thesis sufficiently reflect the content of the work, its structure, and methods of analysis chosen by the author. Completeness of the thesis is determined by the fact that the structure and content of the thesis allowed the author to solve a scientific problem stated in the introduction, and the merits of the thesis should be attributed to sufficiency of the source base, the use of achievements of domestic and foreign historiography, theoretical, methodological conclusions, and generalizations given by the author. While undoubtedly positive strong points of the thesis, it's necessary to note some shortcomings. First, the author of the thesis rightly points out that one of the main tasks of the German propaganda, the local population, was expansion of collaborators in this territory. It would be interesting to see clearer conclusions on the effectiveness of this work and the scale of manifestation of collaboration among Russian and other Slavic peoples, Ukrainians, Belarusians, among Crimean Tatar population. It would be interesting to compare the scale of collaboration in Crimea with other territories of USSR occupied by Germany and their allies in 1941-1944. The social base is not quite clear. What is the ratio of ideological collaborators dissatisfied with Soviet power and politics of the Bolsheviks with those who cooperated with occupation on a daily basis with the aim to simple survival during occupation? Secondly, the author of the thesis particularly did not disclose the question of counter-propaganda carried out in 1941 by partisan groups, and he limited himself to only one area of this activity, the spread of rumors. He does not reveal the entire arsenal of counter-propaganda methods and techniques. Thirdly, stressing the positive side of the thesis, a wide range of scientific literature and sources involved by the included. It's worth saying that some important scientific works remain outside the scope of the thesis. For example, Barinov, Direction Ukraine, Experience of Studying Nazi Occupation Policies, 1941-1944, Moscow, 2014, Maligin, Partisan Movement of Crimea and the Tatar Question, 1941-1944, Simferopol, 2008, Sinitsyn, Soviet-German Ideological Confrontation on the Occupied Territory of the USSR, National Regional Aspects. The thesis was defended 2 years ago, and military history. The remarks have the nature of recommendations and generally do not affect the high opinion of Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan's thesis. It's serious and independent scientific historical research. Its material contribute to significant increase in historical knowledge on the previously understudied issue of history of Crimea during the occupation of 1941-1944. The thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan on the theme Structure and Function of German Propaganda in Crimea, 1941-1944, corresponds requirements set forth on the order of 1st of September 2000, number 70, on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the candidate Kokhan, Andrey Alekseevich, deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Science, Specialty 070002, National History. Paragraph 11 of the above mentioned has not been violated. Member of the Dissertation Council, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of Institute of Political and Social of Petrozavodsk State University, Virigin Sergei Gennadievich. Thank you, Sergei Gennadievich. You saved us 2 minutes. Next, let me give the floor to Evgeny Fedorovich Krinko. Dear colleagues, dear chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear attendees, dear colleagues, the study of Nazi occupation of USSR territories during the Great Patriotic War was for a long time on the periphery of interests of Soviet historians, whose main focus was on various forms of struggle against the invaders. In foreign historiography, few works were devoted to this topic, and the authors did not have access to Soviet archives, and they relied mainly on German trophy documents. In 1990s, there appeared a number of serious studies revealing different directions of occupation policy, both on whole occupied territory and Russia, in some regions, specific separate regions, generally promoted the classification and publication of archival documents. However, many aspects of the problem, including mechanism of management of the occupied territories, which should include activities of propaganda structures, still remain insufficiently studied. In this regard, Kokhan's study of creation of functional German propaganda in 1941 is fully justified, especially taking into account the fact that his research was carried out on the materials of Crimea, occupation of which was one of the longest among other territories, regions of Russia. As we already know, this thesis consists of introduction, 3 chapters, and conclusion. In the introduction, it explains the relevance of the study as dedicated to functioning of system of German propaganda in Crimea, and historiography is a generalized works in creation and function of the system of German propaganda in Crimea. Analyzing the features of previous historiography of the issues, Andrey Alekseevich distinguishes 2 leading areas of his research. First, study problems of formation of the propaganda system of the Third Reich, and coverage of in general and in Crimea in particular, page 5. Probably the author should have used this division in the course of subsequent analysis as well, but historical overview is structured differently. It starts with the presentation of domestic occupation historiography, continues with foreign studies of the propaganda system of the Third Reich, and ends with foreign historiography of occupation regime. So the philosophies of the great number of German, American, English and other historians, political scientists and sociologists. At the same time, historiography review occupation and found no room for a number of key works without which analysis cannot be considered complete. First of all, is a collection of German fascist occupation regime 1941-1940 published in 1965 under editorship of Boltin in Moscow, which represents reports and communications of historians at the Third International Conference, the History of Resistance Movement. Back in 1990s, I read this work, and I still believe that its potential is still being underrated. It holding the scientific forum in Karlovy, Czechoslovakia, and participation of Soviet historians in it were important steps in the development of cooperation with the Western colleagues, which soon began to die down due to internal and external factors. Proceedings of the conference as the first experience of comparative analysis of Nazi occupation in various countries and regions are still relevant today. Not to mention the fact that the very title of the collection used occupation regime rather than occupation policy. I don't have time to dwell more about the difference. There are a number of modern Russian studies on German propaganda during the war and Nazi occupation about the southern and western regions of Russia. Sergei Alekseevich mentioned works on Crimea, but the author could use works, studies in other related to other regions of Russia, and I've even works presented in 2000. Stanislav Berniev, the work of Stanislav Berniev, Goryelkin, Ilins, etc. Of course, not all of them are related to Crimea, but the use of these works would enable the author to compare the work of propaganda bodies to that of other regions, and as well as in other occupied regions of Russia. Most of Ukraine, Belarus, the military system management, which had its own characteristics in the field of propaganda. At the same time, historiographical review considers memoirs of Kalinin, head of the Belarus partisan movement, although should be attributed to historical sources. The applicant sets himself clear goal and objectives, clearly defines chronological and territorial limits as well. On the contrary, definition of the subject looks too general, requires substantial specification. Of course, a strong point is extensive and diverse source of base, a significant part of which is documents extracted from the farms of Russian and foreign archives, some of which have been introduced for the first of all. These are German military and civil documents, cases started by U.S. state security bodies. In total, 188 covered cases from 7 archives. He also says personal origin, including a fairly rare type, as diaries of witnesses to the events of the occupation, as well as periodicals, newspapers published during the occupation, and most importantly that the applicant's critic about the use points out contradictions and a subjective approach. These principles indicate it's generally traditional, but the proposed methods are adequate to the tasks. Characteristics scientific novelty, theoretical and practical significance, as well as provisions to be defended on the third chapter, devoted information and propaganda system in Germany and in the occupied territories. The applicant pays attention to activity of Imperial Ministry of Public Education Propaganda, its contradictions, Hebels with the other ministries of the Third Reich. The author explains reasons for the preservation of the military system in Crimea and investigates problems of organization and function of military propaganda to maintain morale of soldiers in the Crimea. Probably the author should have given assessment of effectiveness of propaganda materials used in the process, but he, Andrey Alekseevich, only mentions that the 11th Army refused services of the 609 propaganda company because of incompetence of its employee, but this happened before the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. The second chapter deals with the establishment activities of the Nazi propaganda bodies aimed at civilian population, analyzing the reasons for cooperation of the population. The author says first and most important, the Soviet regime hoped that Crimea could have been during the Civil War. Pages 63-64. Another, no less important reason for involvement in the civil population in the system of government is national policy supported by propaganda, page 65. However, it's hardly necessary to reduce reasons for collaboration to political factors only. In my opinion, and both social and psychological circumstances, confusion and fear and the successful offensive of the enemy played an important role. At the same time, it's necessary to agree with the applicant that since the invaders carried out the policy of taking foodstuff and cattle from the population to meet the needs of the army, the official propaganda was in contradiction with the real policy of the military administration, page 79. To a large extent, they undermined the authority of the military administration. Yet the conclusion that during the occupation, periodicals were in demand calls for additional evidence. Having studied documents from other regions would enable me to agree with this statement. And evidence reports of biased nature, since these authorities were interested in creating the idea of the effectiveness of a propaganda carried out in the occupied territory. The second chapter also examines propaganda activities of Rosenberg headquarters and other structures. Of particular interest is the final fourth paragraph, which describes in this Voice of Crimea and other publications the system Nazi propaganda. As a result, the applicant comes to a reasonable conclusion that dependence of the printing bodies issued during the occupation of Crimea and various German structures does not allow to consider them Russian publications with the issued under auspices of the German occupation authorities. On the contrary, these were German publications of propagandistic kind printed in Russia and aimed at the local population, pages 112-113. The third chapter reveals features of German propaganda against the Crimean Tatar population. Here gives a lot of valuable information with scientific novelty about the establishment of the national Tatar committees and their role in the field of propaganda activities. These actions were caused by the fact that considered Crimean Tatars their most reliable allies in the region and treated them accordingly. At the same time, establishment of Muslim committees caused the rise of Tatar nationalism, a result undesired for the German command. Based on various sources, the applicant managed to trace attempts of the German command to change the course as well as the failure. The conclusion contains conclusions that meet objectives and provisions formulated in the main part should be recognized as reliable, well argumented and logically consistent. Despite the general rather high assessment of the work done by the applicant, it should be noted a number of weak points, primarily of a qualifying character. First of all, concerns the formulation of tasks. Some look too general, and all in general do not quite correspond to the structure of the work. Out of 6 tasks, first 3 reflect in the first chapter, and the last, the 6th, covers the material of 2 chapters at once. The second and the third, in the first paragraph of the first chapter, and the second there is not enough conclusions. Also some shortcomings, designer references, list of sources. It should also be noticed that use of lowercase and capital letters and name government bodies and authorities does not correspond to the modern rules of the Russian language. I will not go into detail. The work presented would acquire a new level if contained a comparative analysis of effectiveness of the use of various means of propaganda. Its implementation, civil structures, and the author would have used methods of related disciplines such as content analysis or discourse analysis in the study of printed materials. However, this can be considered because the wish to the author to continue work in this direction. In general, the thesis submitted is an independent scientific research carried out on a relevant scientific problem of regional character. The thesis by Alekseevich Kokhan makes a significant contribution to the study of the history of Crimea during the Great Patriotic War. The materials introduced by the author have scientific novelty. The main provisions of the work were reflected in, as mentioned by the chairman, 3 publications from the list recommended by the Higher Attestation Committee. This enabled me to say that the thesis by Alekseevich Kokhan, theme, structure and function of the German propaganda in Crimea 1941-1944, fully corresponds to the basic requirements established by the order of the 1st of September 2016, 6821/1 on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and the applicant deserves the degree of candidate of historical sciences, specialty 070002, national history. Paragraph 11 of the order has not been violated by the applicant. Thank you. Thank you, Evgeny Fedorovich. Let me give the floor to Oleg Valentynovich Romanko. Dear Chairman of the Dissertation Council, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues, The history of Nazi propaganda before and during the Second World War is generally studied in some detail. Post-war period, domestic and foreign historians have reconstructed the chronology of the main events of the psychological war, analyzed the structure, functionings and consequences of propaganda created by them. However, it should be noted that a number of fragments of these events need further study, clarification or even rethinking. In our opinion, such fragments belong to the history and creation of functioning German propaganda system in the Crimea in 1941-1944. First, this problem has not yet become the subject of a comprehensive scientific study, and all publications about it are very scarce. Secondly, the history of German propaganda on the occupied peninsula has closest connection with another controversial issue of historiographer World War II, collaboration of the local population with the military and political structures of Nazi Germany. And finally, thirdly, we should emphasize the multi-ethnic nature of a region such as Crimea, where all activities of the occupation authorities and propaganda inevitably fell under the influence of ethno-religious factor. In this regard, the thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan seems to be very timely and relevant. When writing the thesis, the author executed all the necessary standard requirements. Introduction, this explains object and subject, chronological and territorial frameworks. The purpose, research tasks are formulated, scientific novelty, theoretical and practical value of the work are shown. In the historiographer review, Andrey Alekseevich analyzed the previously established scientific and historical base, priority areas of study of those issues that are considered in his thesis. The historiography of each of the directions is presented by a sufficient amount of works. Conclusions are made which characterize the achievements of predecessors. Rethinking of a number of publications, the analysis enabled the author to avoid single-mindedness. Besides, in our opinion, it's very important that the literature was analyzed not only in Russian, but also in other languages, for example, in English, German, and Ukrainian. Nevertheless, it should be pointed that not all new literature on the subject theme of the study came into the attention to Andrey Alekseevich. Monograph by Zatov, Crimean Tatar Stage Art Materials of the Kazakh Occupation, Simferopol, 2015. The basis of the thesis is very diverse, represented by published documents, memoirs, periodicals, 1941, and of course archival. Among the letters necessary to highlight materials from archives such as Russian State Archive of Republic of Crimea, National Archival Administration, United States, Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, Central State Archives, the highest authorities of Ukraine. We would like to pay special attention to the fact that in his research, Andrey Alekseevich actively uses documents of special services, namely Archive of Federal Security Bureau of Republic of Ukraine. It should be stressed that most of the documents from the files of these archives are introduced in scientific circulation for the first time. And the thesis consists of introduction, 3 chapters and conclusion. First chapter, the author examines the process of creating a system of general military propaganda in the initial stages of occupations until fall of 1942, fairly arguing that monopoly in creating the meanings of propaganda remained with the department of Goebbels. Andrey Alekseevich at the same time concludes that on the ground, for example in Crimea, daily propaganda activities fell on the shoulders of representatives of other departments, namely of appropriate structures of Wehrmacht in the face of propaganda, of road propaganda, etc. To a large extent, this was due to the fact that Peninsula has been a war zone for a long time, and the military administration received all the managerial functions. In addition, Crimea was the first Soviet region where, under the German occupation, got a fairly large Muslim population, Crimean Tatars. Building relations with them became one of the primary tasks of the German 11th Army. Finally, it was during this period they became clear with its military administration will not be able to create an effective propaganda press. Andrey Alekseevich makes a correct conclusion. The same Crimean Tatar issue would hardly do without support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, authorized by the 11th Army. In autumn 1942, in the territory of the Crimean Peninsula was finally established German occupation regime in the former military administration. All the managerial functions were entrusted to the commander of the Wehrmacht troops in Crimea. Similarly, other permanent bodies began to be formed in the sphere of psychological warfare. Such body was the headquarters of propaganda, Crimea, activity of which is discussed in the second chapter of the thesis. Considering the creation and function of this body, the author reasonably argues that it was during this period that the most active involvement of the local population in various collaboration structures began. In the sphere of propaganda was no exception. Generally speaking, but Andrey Alekseevich shows that it has significant character, at least until 1943, in terms of motivation of some collaborators, was caused by peculiarities of social and political development of the pre-war society. At the same time, he disproves the established stereotype of the Soviet historiography about the marginal unimportance of this phenomenon. For example, the history of Simferopol newspaper, The Voice of Crimea, Kokhan shows that the Germans were helped by the educated people, the cream of crime intelligence. In many ways, it increased the effectiveness of the Nazi propaganda. The facts presented in Chapter 3 are absolute merit of the thesis. Here, Andrey Alekseevich analyzes the role of Crimean Tatar factors in occupation policy of the Nazis. It's impossible to say that this factor not became a subject of scientific research before. However, in the previous works, it was mainly about its military and political component. While Andrey Alekseevich successfully closed this gap, having considered in detail the place of Muslim committees, the main collaborator Crimean Tatar organizations, in the system of German propaganda. Based on the previously unpublished documents from the archives of the special services, the author showed how the occupants influenced the German Tatar population through these committees in various spheres: military, social, cultural, etc. And this influence was quite successful. Nevertheless, one cannot disagree with Andrey Alekseevich that approximately from summer 1940, the Crimean Tatar collaborators, as well as the rest of the population, started experiencing a crisis of loyalty towards Germans. In general, the reasons were the same as those of the main Tatar population. However, the author points one more reason. The Crimean Tatar national movement has never received serious political rights from the German military and political administration. Summing up his thesis, Andrey Alekseevich rightly notes that during the German occupation of Crimea and its territory was created complex and complicated propaganda, noting the initial effectiveness of information and psychological impact on the population. The author concludes that a significant role in these successes belongs to the local stuff of German propaganda collaborators of different nationalities. Nevertheless, by the middle of 1942, effectiveness of occupation propaganda began to decline. According to Andrey Alekseevich, it was due to two reasons. First, cuirassiers of the propaganda apparatus, which only formally obeyed the German military administration of the peninsula and in fact had their own heads in various ministries and departments of Germany. And secondly, it's equally important to say that over the time, the picture painted by the German population, by German propaganda, and their local began to sharply contrast reality. At the same time, in addition, some comments must be made. First, the source base collected by Andrey Alekseevich is certainly representative and allows to fully realize all research tasks. Nevertheless, there's a question why the author left out quite a big memories came out of German partisans environment. For example, memoirs and diaries of Nikolai Dmitrich Lugovoy contains interesting and valuable information about the confrontation with the German propaganda system and collaborators. This same can be said is true about documents of the Crimean partisan movement, found P151, the State Archive of Republic of Crimea. For some reason, Andrey Alekseevich did not use. Second, analyzing the system of propaganda created by the Germans, the author tells mainly about activities conducted by headquarters of the 11th Army, Wehrmacht troops and subordinate structures, military structures. However, Andrey Alekseevich himself points out, paragraph 3, chapter 2, on the territory of peninsula at the same time the headquarters of Reichsleiter Rosenberg and the bodies of police propaganda were active. In our opinion, it would be more interesting to consider factors of their participation in psychological warfare in more detail, as well as to show cooperation or contradiction with military propaganda bodies. Third, the main body of German propaganda on the peninsula, headquarters of propaganda Crimea, worked not in a vacuum but actually cooperated with similar structures in other occupied territories. At the same time, such relations were established both vertically and horizontally. Andrey Alekseevich writes about these connections in his study, but not in enough detail, in our opinion. In this regard, it should be shown how Crimean propaganda interacted with their colleagues from, for example, Vice Commissary Ukraine, the military administrations in North Caucasus, etc. 4. Andrey Alekseevich's study contains a lot of factual material. However, there are many important aspects that not left out of sight. For example, role of German propaganda in popularization of Rosenberg New Land Order, recruitment of volunteers to the so-called Russian Liberation Army, etc. 5. The structure of the thesis, without any doubt, has its own integral logic. In our opinion, small distance between the research tasks and topics of the paragraphs. Talking about paragraph 4, chapter 2, where Andrey Alekseevich mentions the voice of Crimea, explains the role of the editorial board in the events of activities of German propaganda. Why did the author consider it necessary to highlight this separate paragraph while in the territory of Crimean Peninsula? At least 15 other newspapers were published. 6. Andrey Alekseevich reasonably separate third chapter for Crimean Tatar issue, Crimean occupation policy. This is quite justified, considering the role that the Nazi military political leadership gave to Crimean Tatars in the light of their eastern policy. However, Crimea was still home to a number of other ethnic groups to which Germany had special interest. In this case, the thesis would have gained a lot if Andrey Alekseevich analyzed how occupants used Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian and national collaborators in their propaganda. 7. Finally, the use of German terms which established analogues in the Russian language. I mean such words as Ortskommandatura, Feldkommandatura, etc. Nevertheless, these comments have no significant impact on the overall positive assessment of this in-depth and relevant study. The thesis is by a promising young scientist, in the course of which Andrey Alekseevich demonstrated a high scientific and theoretical level and all the necessary qualification skills. The contents of the thesis reflected in 11 publications and has been tested in presentations at scientific conferences. The thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan on the theme structure and function in German propaganda in Crimea 1941-1944 corresponds to the basic requirements established by the order of the 1st of September 2016 6821/1 on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the applicant, Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan, deserves the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialty 070002, the history of national history. Paragraph 11 of the order has not been violated. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Oleg Valentinovich. Now we have Belgrade online. Thank you for waiting, Alexey Yurievich. If you can hear us, we would like to give the floor to you now, and we would like to hear your review of the thesis. Dear colleagues, the regulation is 3 minutes for my speech. No. 5. 10 minutes. You have 10 minutes. Okay, nice. Thank you. Dear colleagues, I will talk about my review to the thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan. We all know that in 2020, the 75th anniversary of Victory shall be celebrated, and historiography still has a large number of poorly studied aspects of the events of global and regional nature. And this is obvious because archives of Russia, Ukraine, Germany, US, and many funds were not available to researchers for USSR. This slowed down and still slows down the study of Great Patriotic War, especially such sensitive issues such as Nazi propaganda in the temporarily occupied territories of the Soviet Union, cooperation of the local population with the civil and military administrations of the Nazi Germany. That's why such study covering this is of high scientific importance and relevance. Generally, it should be said that, as was already mentioned by others, for the study of Nazi propaganda and authorities responsible for implementation began on the eve of World War II and during World War II. And the government of the United States and Soviet Union closely follow information and propaganda organs in the Reich, studied methods used by military civilian propaganda in the Reich. And they found Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf said that Germany lost World War I because of poor propaganda. So if something should work well, it was the propaganda system in Third Reich. During the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors from the studied activities of Nazi ministries and their individual representatives, including those related to propaganda activities in occupied territories. The study of Nazi propaganda is still ongoing. However, while activities of such central bodies responsible as has been studied, and the regional aspects has not been studied enough. Crimea is a good example. The thesis in question gives us a good idea of how the system of the Nazi propaganda was formed in the territory of Crimea in 1941-1944, what local factors influenced its changes, and how the system was controlled through complex hierarchical model created by the military administration of the Wehrmacht in Crimea. The geographical frame outlines territory of the Crimean Peninsula. Even the administrative division of the Nazi occupational government, the territory was included in the general region of Crimea. Race Commissariat of the author says that the system of administration in Crimea has never worked. For example, as part of the study, the author tried to analyze the system of creation and functioning of propaganda in the Reich, the relationship with the Reich ministers in terms of conducting propaganda activities, identify common German, Crimean regional factors that influence the system of formation of propaganda apparatus in the temporarily occupied territory of the peninsula. The chronological framework also is well justified. It covers the period from 1941 to 1944, the period of temporary Nazi occupation. In this case, the author deliberately goes beyond these frames, especially consideration of issues of Russian, Crimean, Tatar collaboration to show which caused this cooperation. And in general, the applicant coped well with this task. He made an attempt to study the system of military propaganda in the temporarily occupied under the conditions of interaction and counteraction between various authorities. The applicant was able to analyze the main factors that influenced formation of the system of military propaganda on the basis of archival sources and agreements concluded in the Reich ministers in Nazi Germany, revealed principles of formation of organs of military propaganda, reconstruction of the main stages of its formation. The thesis determines importance of the central all-German factors that influenced the formation of the propaganda system in the temporarily occupied territory, identified the regional reasons that influenced the strengthening of the military propaganda in the region, which include proximity to the front line, multi-ethnic region, a strong guerrilla movement, gravitation of local intellectuals to Wehrmacht soldiers, and rejection of the employees from civil administrations. In addition to theoretical work, the work has scientific and practical importance. Many of the topics covered by the thesis can become subject of further in-depth scientific study. And in addition to relevance, has scientific importance. Worth paying attention to the source based used by the applicant in his work. When writing his thesis, he used archival materials from Russia, Ukraine, United States of America. In addition to central and federal archives, the author used documents, departmental archives, particularly valuable archival cases against journalists and members of the editorial boards of propaganda periodicals published in Crimea in 1941-1944. As reviews, analytical notes created during the Great Patriotic covering activities of city government and the Nazi military administration. Many documents have been introduced in scientific circulation for the first time. It's also worth noting extensive historiography used by the applicant in preparation for this work. In addition to classical monographs, he uses latest articles and monographs. In addition to Russian and Ukrainian historiography, the author is guided by American and German literature on this subject. Of particular interest in the work are the sections related to the study of military propaganda bodies of in Crimea. On the basis of archival and colleague reveals main reasons for cooperation of journalists and editorial board of Voice of Crimea with the military propaganda body. Taken as a basis the protocols of interrogations of journalists and correspondents, he managed to reconstruct and identify the influence, the change in structure of propaganda bodies after retreat of the German troops. Another important subject considered in the study is the study of Nazi propaganda aimed at Crimean Tatar population and propagation aimed at Crimean Tatars. The author analyzes propaganda activities for Crimea aimed at Crimean Tatars. He shows how propaganda aimed at Crimean Tatar population at the same time was object and subject of activities. At the same time, while reading the thesis, I got some questions. The author should pay more attention to various ethnic groups. Detail towards Russian and Tatar groups, but no attention is paid to activities of Armenian, Ukrainian and other collaboration communities which functioned in Crimea since mid-1942. Also it should be said that during the occupation more than 15 periodicals, at least over 10 periodicals and be published, but colleague focuses only on two central bodies, Voice of Crimea, Zat Crimea. One refers to changes direction. The author describes in detail the changes in the structure of propaganda system and only briefly touches upon issues. I know German propaganda in Serbia, Yugoslavia, propaganda changed depending on the situation in the society and the military developments, and loyalty to local population increased. So this issue has not been studied enough in the thesis. Nevertheless, these remarks don't affect the overall importance, and the author fully deserves the degree. The thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan on the theme Structure and Functioning of German Propaganda in Crimea, 1941-1944, corresponds to the basic requirements established by the order of the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1, on order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and the applicant, Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan, deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialty 070002, National History. Clause 11 of the order has not been violated by the thesis. Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of Department of Philosophy, Alekseevich Timofeyev. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Alekseevich. And our procedure requires a review of the chairman, and I also read the thesis, and in my review I say that the thesis is dedicated to very relevant and is of great historical significance because it touches one of the key issues, a national issue. I say that crime became frontline territory beyond outside jurisdiction of civil administration, was not included in Rights Commissaire of Ukraine. The author rightly emphasizes that propaganda apparatus in this territory was an integral part of administrative military system, of the governance system, and was a complex mechanism. Representatives of key ministries of the Third Reich were involved in it. In addition, this system became a center of attraction for all representatives of the local collaborators, leaders of Muslim committees, representatives of the Russian Liberation Army, and anyone dissatisfied with the Soviet regime. The author demonstrates a thorough knowledge of historiography, does not ignore the achievements of his predecessors of the Soviet era and of the transition perestroika period, who explored the new order of the German fascism in the occupied territory. It's also important to stress that the author analyzes studies by Western authors, including military era works, where he describes a number of cinematography which studied the Nazi issue of Nazi propaganda during World War II. The subject matter, chronological and territorial scope of the study were correctly defined and are beyond question any doubt. It's particularly noteworthy that the thesis presented is based on an extremely wide range of sources. In addition to memoirs and diaries, periodicals, the author uses materials from a number of collections in 7 archives, federal, departmental, and foreign. Some of the material from the thesis have been put into scientific circulation for the first time. In this, we would like to note German documents kept at U.S. National Archives. They enable to trace how the Nazi propaganda organs have been formed, including work among the civilian popular materials of the State Archive of Republic of Crimea, gave the author an opportunity to reconstruct the structure and main activities of the propaganda headquarters, as well as to evaluate some of the activities. Documents of the Central State Archive of High Authorities of Ukraine created prerequisites for studying the daily activities of Nazis in Crimea, including the use of local scientific personnel for preparation of studies of economy and history of the peninsula, as well as identification of works involved in propaganda purposes. Reports of local and garrison commandant officers give some idea of political sentiments of the local population and cover process of formation of administrative apparatus and reveal problems of its formation in different regions of the peninsula. And finally, it's hard to overestimate the informal significance of a fragmented archive and cases started by US state security bodies in relation to Crimean collaborators. FSB archive for Crimea and Sebastopol, Crimean cases of former burgomasters, head of city police departments, as well as journalists and reporters and newspapers published during the allowed the author to make important conclusions regarding motivation of residents who cooperated with the German military regime. In addition to archival cases, the thesis uses reports, orders on IKVD, which are stored archives of FSB, the Crimea and Sebastopol, as well as branch state archive of Security Service of Ukraine. Based on a wide range of sources, the author was able to identify peculiarities of formation and functioning of the military administration and to characterize the main stages of formation of these bodies, which operated under conditions not only of interaction but also confrontation with each other, which was evident, particularly the issue of the withdrawal and removal of cultural property. Obviously, and as the author mentions, the new order in the Crimea functioned due to insignificant economic transformations, propaganda measures, and was guaranteed by combat efficiency, German troops, punitive system, police and special forces. So the newspaper was a Crimea, which was an instrument of German propaganda machine, was distributed since 1943, huge circulation, the territory of the peninsula and beyond, but it had no independence at all. All issues were edited by the German occupation command administration. Determine the reason of political collaboration, the role of local people's collaborations to form a system of propaganda in the region. The author rightly singled out not only the dissatisfaction of some Crimeans with the Soviet regime and the so-called immigrant factor, but also the national policy supported by propaganda, not only the Romer's propaganda machine adopted the idea of cooperation with Crimean Tatars in further promotion to the east and the fight against the Bolsheviks. At the same time, the general orientation of the occupation policy towards Crimean Tatars was reduced to granting them limited autonomy only in the field of culture and religion. Moreover, these areas, according to the author's assessment, as well as activities of the Muslim committees, were under constant supervision of SD, the body responsible for forming the Tatar committees in Crimea. The administrative and political activities of Crimean Tatars were seriously limited. Although here too the occupiers lacked a common position, the role of Tatar committees in the future, free from Bolsheviks, Crimea was assessed differently. Noting the author's serious achievements to the study of problem propaganda activities in the occupation administration of Crimea, let us point out some shortcomings of his work, which could be considered as a wish for further scientific work of Kokhan, criticizing a number of works which, in his opinion, did not pay sufficient attention to the economic component in the life of the occupied region, do not properly address issues of interaction between the civilian population and the occupation troops. The author doesn't say anything about the issue of the mission activities of the occupation regime in Crimea. This problem, it seems to us, is directly related not only to the economic but also to propaganda activities of the occupants. How was the system of financial settlement with the civilian population cooperating with the new administration organized? What was the monetary circulation in the Crimea? Was it based on race, so Ukraine, or was it different? There's no answer to this question in the thesis. Could be a subject of independent study. The thesis submitted for defense would have benefited if the author paid more attention to successful and hard-to-read structures, technical defects in printing, given the number of pages, erroneous naming of some modern periodicals. Do you know the number? Given the number, width of line in the end of many pages, and other errors to some degree made it difficult to get acquainted with the text. Despite these minor remarks, I would like to say that the work under discussion today is an original study based on extensive factual material, and the author has managed to address a number of important scientific issues. And the thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan on the subject structure and functioning of the German propaganda in the Crimea, 1941-1944, corresponds to the basic requirements established by the order, the 1st of September 2016, 6821/1 on the order awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the applicant, Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan, deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialty 07-0002, Russian History. Paragraph 11 of the order has not been violated by the thesis. We also have a review by Boris Nikolaevich Kovalov. Shall we read, or we have it somewhere? Thank you very much, Boris Nikolaevich Kovalov. Unfortunately, is absent for a good reason, but he is a well-known expert on this issue. He sent a detailed review in which he says that national and international historiography studied the history of the Great Patriotic War, Second World War, the creation and functioning of propaganda and collaborationist groups, operating in the temporarily occupied territories. Nevertheless, the regional aspects of functioning of the propaganda system created in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, interaction with collaborators from local population, white immigrants, remain poorly studied. An advantage of Mr. Kokhan's research is that it sheds light on aspects of functioning military propaganda system at a local level, on the example of the Crimean Peninsula occupied by the Nazi troops, and the researcher himself pays significant attention to the causes and forms of interaction of the local intellectuals with the military administration, the German occupation troops. Kokhan clearly defined the subject purpose and managed to show the changes in the Nazi propaganda system on the temporarily occupied territory of the Crimea, identified causes of such changes, both internal, related to internal party struggle and national and political factors in the region, and external, related to successful and failed military operations of the German troops on the Eastern Front. The applicant revealed the least studied aspects in the history of creation and functioning of the German propaganda system in the Crimea, the reasons and the process of creation of the propaganda headquarters Crimea, agitation, propaganda activities of the Wehrmacht units in relation towards Tatar population in the region, the confrontation between the civil and military propaganda formations acting on the temporarily occupied territory. Then next, Boris Nikolaevich pays attention to sources used by the merit of the work is in the fact that the applicant, in addition to documents from the central archives of the Russian Federation and Ukraine's central state archives of higher authorities of Ukraine and the United States, used materials from departmental archive of FSB, Republic of Crimea and Sebastopol, Ukraine, and copies of documents for the Republic of Crimea in Holocaust Museum in the US. These documents can be divided into two conventional groups: reports of NKVD bodies related to activities of German occupation authorities, city administrations and regional branch of the Rosenberg headquarters, as well as investigated cases, security bodies in relation to citizens who cooperated with the occupation troops of Germany. These sources are of great interest to researchers as they give an idea of the reasons for cooperation Soviet citizens who found themselves in the territories temporarily occupied by the German troops, the forms of interaction of the German bureaucracy and Wehrmacht with the local population, and the functioning of the propaganda and military administration. In addition, it should be noted that the vast majority of sources used for writing the thesis have been introduced into scientific circulation for the first time. The marked geographical chronological framework, clearly, Crimean Peninsula, during the period of 1941-1944, despite the fact that Crimea was formerly part of the general district of Tavria, it had not civil but military administration. The applicant adheres to both geographical and chronological frames, going beyond them only to show the reason for the increasing role of military propaganda in the region in relation to civilians, or to determine the motivation for cooperation of some local residents with the occupation Nazi troops. In general, the author coped with the tasks he set himself. He managed to identify the main issues in the formation of the propaganda system of Germany, determine the place and functions of the propaganda system of military management in the Crimea during the temporary occupation of 1941-1944, determine the causes and forms of interaction of collaborators and the military management, as well as managed to differentiate the functions of various bodies responsible for propaganda activities in Crimea. The work is constructed on a thematic and chronological principle. Consists of three sections. The first one is devoted to formation of the bodies responsible for carrying out propaganda activities directly in the German Reich, highlights problems of struggle between party bureaucracy in attempt to lead propaganda effort both inside Germany and outside. This section is necessary because the applicant demonstrates how the internal party struggle and confrontation between German ministries influenced the formation of propaganda organs in the temporarily occupied territories of the Soviet Union, primarily in the Crimea. In the second section, the author focuses on the main and auxiliary bodies of the Nazi propaganda in the region. This is the most extensive and informative section of the thesis, which accounts for the largest number of archival sources used in the thesis. The question has been poorly studied both by domestic and foreign historians. The third section is devoted to the interaction of the Nazi regime with the Crimean population of the peninsula and was introduced into the study in order to outline peculiarities of relations between the German military and Crimean Tatar elite, and with this example to show how the use of national factor was used by the Nazi propaganda. When getting acquainted with the thesis, there's a number of questions and comments. First, it would be very interesting to see how the image of Crimea was presented in other areas of USSR occupied by the Nazis and their allies. Unfortunately, the author ignored the article by B.N. Kovalov, Crimea, on the pages of the Russian Collaboration Press in northwest Russia. Yalta, 2016, Materials Prestigious Scientific Conference. Second, the research examines in some detail the structures of propaganda bodies, trying to identify factors that influenced it. It's also worth paying attention to the activities carried out by those propaganda authorities, campaign related to attempts of agrarian reform, anti-partisan propaganda campaign, etc. Third, the applicant should pay more attention to the attempts to carry out propaganda activities in relation to different national and religious groups. If in the thesis the issues of propaganda and propaganda influence on the Russian and Crimean Tatars are discussed in detail, the author practically omits propaganda influence Armenian, Ukrainian, German population of the peninsula. It should also be mentioned that these remarks do not affect the significance of the thesis, and in conclusion, the author says that the thesis by Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan, Structure and Function of German Propaganda in Crimea 1941-1944, corresponds to the basic requirements established by the order, the 1st of September 2016, 68-21/1, on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and the applicant, Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan, deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences in Specialty 070002, National History. Paragraph 11 of the order has not been violated by the thesis. Well, that, as I understand, these are all the official reviews submitted that are available to us today. Now, let us give the floor to the applicant for his comments and to answer questions, comments made. You have a time limit of 15 minutes, please. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, I am very grateful for your reviews, for your comments, and I will do it in the alphabetical order. It's up to you, Sergei Gennadievich. Counter-propaganda from Soviet administration, of course included, but is a number of peculiarities which should be mentioned. First of all, a problem with radio propaganda. Before Russian army, radio receivers, special radios, and when German and regime, all the radios were taken away from the population, and that is why counter propaganda is so important. Should be mentioned. Example with November 1942, one of the secretaries, Mustafayev, established a secret center starts Soviet counter-propaganda aimed at the Tatar population, but he was half a year late, and already Germans started their propaganda activities towards aimed at the Tatar population. If we look at counter-propaganda, first we should talk about leaflets published locally, maybe not, and also imported, and posters. First of all, handwritten posters, because very few propaganda posts, mostly in Sebastopol. As for number of volunteers and counting the number of collaborators who took part in military actions or political collaborators, we may say that of Tatar collaborators, 19 or 20,000, and about 5,000. And as for activities of Russian Liberation Army in Crimea, it's hard to give exact numbers. We can only mention some officers who were active in the occupation zones: Maltsin, Shiryaev, Baryatinsky in Crimea. 10-15 people we know from investigation cases and from periodicals. And of course, these are representatives of other national formations, Armenian Legion, but which was fairly small. Draconian, when he entered in Crimea, only an intelligence school was established, and Armenian Legion was not based in Crimea. As for Alum, I shall talk about it later, answering questions of your colleagues. Next, as for social basis for collaborators, in the end of 1941, early 1942, the advantage was mostly intelligentsia. These were mostly doctors, descendants of noble families, repressed by Soviet regime, relatives of the white immigrants, including university teachers and schools who stayed in Crimea. Later, the social basis changed significantly when staff shortage started. When Germans couldn't find people they could afford, put in managerial positions in rural communities. Then they started to attract volunteers with any background, and was carpenters, doctors, people who tried to make their living should not be regarded as collaborators. So this is a very sensitive and painful issue that calls for needs to be further study. Evgeny Fedorovich, thank you for your review. As for factors which I mentioned, political factors, ethnic factors, I all briefly economic factor, and I of course thank you for mentioning psychological factor, which I did not discuss in my thesis, except that psychological factor I did not consider. As for the demand for campaign materials, we have reports from authorities. Could be. We also have cases, about 45 filtration cases in the National Archive of Crimea. In 2009, 2011, I looked through all of them, and I can assure you that first group of volunteers went to Germany. They were volunteers. They were not forced. They were volunteers. In interrogation protocols, they say they went for economic reasons or they followed Nazi propaganda. So you may say that there was a demand for agitation materials. On the other hand, the newspaper Voice of Crimea, if you compare this newspaper to other newspapers published on the occupied territory in the south of Russia, it is same level as Morning of Caucasus, and its quality was much higher compared to Nikolaevsky New Word, because the last two publications were mostly as commercial or Voice of Crimea provided information, and because its editorial board included former noblemen, they tried to popularize the Russian culture. Great number of articles on theater, great number of articles on classical Russian literature. That is why the demand for this newspaper was higher. Next, Oleg Valentinovich, thank you for your review. As for the use of fund of P151, the foundation, if we talk about this foundation in Crimea, was divided into two parts. P151, the State Archive of Crimea, and folders, reports of NKVD servicemen in partisan troops. Unfortunately, this is classified information. As for P151, this fund is fragmented. We have some idea of counter propaganda from the partisan movement, but these materials I did not include in my thesis because similar data has been included in other funds, materials of security services. Why exactly Voice of Crimea? This question was also asked by Alexei Yurievich and Boris Nikolaevich. The matter is, the Voice of Crimea, as I mentioned, was a central newspaper with great circulation. We don't have full circulation. Yevpatery's newsletter, Farmer of Taurid, it's hard to talk about other newspapers because not being familiar with materials that they published. In addition, materials published by the Voice of Crimea was reprinted by other publications, including manuals sent to regional field regional authorities. That is why Voice of Crimea can I take it as an example to study. I mentioned other newspapers, but they didn't have that much influence. As for the factors of cooperation with Rosenberg, SD, and other authorities, with Rosenberg, relations was quite tense. We may say, but 3 joint exhibitions, the exhibitions anniversary of occupation of Crimea. Since 1943, staff journalists of Voice of Crimea, they entered Crimean propaganda headquarters as staff employees, as key employees, but at the same time they work at Rosenberg headquarters. For example, in 1942, early 1943, these two they merged and the conflict was eliminated locally. As for words and phrases or this problem, because I use sources in German and cases, investigation cases, because very often these these words are used, such as Staffel propaganda. That is why that's why I used the words. And Alexei Yurievich, I am very grateful to you for your review. As for periodicals, I think I answered the question about the Voice of Crimea. As for propaganda among ethnic groups, Boris Nikolaevich also asked this question. We may say that the national propaganda was aimed at Armenian committees, but it's important to remember that Armenian committees were formed, unlike Muslim committees. They were formed on a different principle. Armenian committees were fully established by German officers. Our Armenian committees were forced spontaneously in the beginning of 1942 as religious communities, and only after Abwehr Commander Drokanayana entered Crimea, then these committees became subject to Abwehr, and school intelligence was established. We cannot trace this, how propaganda was conducted aimed at Armenian population. As for help to Ukrainian people, we may say that in Crimea, Ukrainian nationalists of Melnik and Bandera nature. As for Bandera followers who entered Crimea, the shooting of Janko, about 16 people were executed, and in Crimea, OUN was legally active in Crimea, and some policemen were OUN. We may say that active in Simferopol, Sebastopol, Evpatoria, for which we have reliable data. We may also mention Feodosia and possibly in Kerch. But propaganda work was conducted. It was not controlled by German occupation authorities. The greatest assistance service was in Eupatoria, because in Eupatoria in 1941-1942 was member of OUN. He distributed periodicals, because others were not, so regardless of what OUN distributed periodicals, OUNP. Mikhail Viktorovich, thank you for your review. As for financial activities, emission activities, in 1941, November, 1 German mark was equal to 10 rubles. As monetary operations were conducted with a local population. They were not given German marks, they were paid in rubles, but we should keep in mind that barter became common practice, and part of economic was barter, was explained by famine, unemployment in 1941-42, and famine. And as for review by Boris Nikolaevich, we may say that totally there were about 7 or 8 large propaganda actions. First propaganda action started 1941-1944. That was German weapons, strength of power of Germany, role of Germany in the world policy. Second the major campaign was campaign for introduction of the land order, which has never been approved in the Crimea. It didn't go beyond various declarations. Next major campaign, Andrey Alekseevich, your time is up, and I'm finishing the review. My comments to Boris Nikolaevich. Large major campaign, propaganda campaign. The image of Crimea was to be presented as a stronghold. This was necessary for civilian population and for German servicemen in the Crimea. That's all. Thank you. I think maybe not everybody is satisfied, as we had too many questions, and the questions were too difficult, but overall, so we got some general answers. Now our procedure provides for speeches. I think 2 people would like to speak. Nikolai Nikolaevich, welcome if you wanted to speak. Nikolai Nikolaevich Smirnov of St. Petersburg Institute History of Russian Academy of Sciences. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Not more than 5 minutes. I will be very brief. 5 minutes will be enough for me. Let me introduce myself. Nikolai Nikolaevich Smirnov, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, Head of Department of St. Petersburg Institute of History of Russian Academy of Sciences. Dear colleagues, the thesis by Andrey Alekseevich I read long before this defense procedure, and already at that time I paid attention that this is a very serious researcher who is not afraid to touch upon a sensitive issue which is still being discussed a lot, and a lot was this was mentioned already many times. I'd like to say the interdisciplinary nature of this study. I think it will be interesting not only for researchers and teachers of national history, but for experts in world history, because a big part of the thesis is devoted to the work of Nazi Germany conducted in occupied territories, for including occupied territories of USSR. I think approach has a lot in common in understanding this policy of Andrey Alekseevich and researcher Boris Nikolaevich Kovalov, who studies collaboration movement and policy of German Nazi in Leningrad region, Novgorod region, and Andrey Alekseevich is studying the policy in Crimea, which is a very difficult region. What I would like the author to pay more attention not only to the issues of collaboration, but also other issues of local population. But I hope that Andrey Alekseevich will continue his work. I hope that in the future he will write an interesting monograph, and this aspect to which I would like to draw his attention will be covered in his future monograph. I have no doubt that the work under discussion deserves the degree of candidate of historical sciences. Thank you very much. And I saw that Evgeny Pavlovich, also Guriev, St. Petersburg State University of Architecture and Construction. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Let me tell Guri Evgeny Pavlovich, candidate of historical sciences, associate professor. I read the thesis as a manuscript. It was very interesting for me because my scientific interests, I study World War II and Nazi Germany, so this work was extremely interesting for me. It seemed to be very rich in facts, and source base archives of 3 countries is very impressive, and the number of references is impressive. The impressive historiography, which covers all the key works, monographs in various languages, in 4 different languages. And in general, I think the work is very interesting. The issue has not been sufficiently studied. The issue related to Nazi propaganda and occupation policies, occupation authorities in occupied regions, including the Crimea, and generally the work deserves highest opinion, and Andrey Alekseevich Kokhan certainly deserves to be awarded the degree of sought academic degree. Thank you. Thank you. The procedure provides for opportunity to answer, or I would only like to say thank you for your comments. Now let us give the floor to the academic supervisor, Alexander Sergeyevich Puchenkov, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, St. Petersburg University. Not more than 3 minutes, please. Dear colleagues, I have known Andrey Alekseevich for a long time, and since the beginning he was introduced as a highly professional expert on archive materials, and when we met several years ago, I was very impressed by how familiar he, how many documents he knows, and I was how passionate he was. It happens so that during the time that he had to write his thesis, Andrey Alekseevich could not present his thesis. That was not his fault, it just happened that way, but many people become desperate in this situation. Andrey Alekseevich had a ready manuscript, and several years ago we started working together. My work mostly was in guidance. Andrey Alekseevich knew everything already. He was a highly skilled professional. He was well familiar with archive sources for a number of reasons, because classified archives, many such archives in the future, and certainly I believe that Andrey Alekseevich is well familiar with the context of World War II, Great Patriotic War, and the history of Crimea. It's obvious that what I liked in his work is that the Crimean context is linked to general issues of Nazi propaganda in general, the Third Reich, a general military component, what happened in 1941, 1944, and I am sure that this work can later to become a monograph that will be interesting to a wide range of readers. And I am absolutely sure that Andrey Alekseevich deserves the degree of candidate of historical sciences. I think that's one of the strongest works submitted for the degree of candidate of history I've read in recent years. I hope that my opinion will coincide with that of my respected colleagues. Thank you. Thank you, Alexander Sergeyevich. We heard all the reviews that were submitted. We've given the floor to all the attendees who wanted to speak. Now we need some time to discuss, so we are kindly requesting anyone who is not a member of the Dissertation Council to leave us for a few minutes so that we could make the decision, and we shall invite you to come back shortly. Thank you. Andrey Alekseevich is here, which is the most important thing. Let's resume our meeting. I put the awarding the academic degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences to Kokhan Andrey Alekseevich, Specialty 070002 National History. The procedure provides for open individual voting according to the approved procedure. Sergei Gennadievich Virigin. My opinion coincides with the official review. I think that Andrey Alekseevich deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialty 070002 National History. Evgeny Fedorovich Krinko. I am definitely for awarding the degree to Andrey Alekseevich, the degree of Candidate of History, Specialty 070002 National History. Oleg Valentinovich Romanko. My opinion during our discussion has not changed since the beginning. I believe that Andrey Alekseevich deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Specialty 070002 National History. We still have Alexei Yurovich Timofeyev with us. We know his opinion, but could he say it again? I think that the thesis by Kokhan Research deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialty 070002. Thank you. I also have the same opinion. Boris Nikolaevich, even though he's not with us today, in his review he voted for. So counting the votes is not too difficult. I like to say that 6 that the 5 members participate in the meeting have voted for, no one voted against, no one abstained, and the decision to award to Andrey Alekseevich degree of Candidate of Historical Sciences, Specialty 0700 National History, has been made. The final word of the applicant, please, if you want to add something, if you want to say something in the official part. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, I am very grateful to you for your high opinion given to my thesis. I'd like to thank 2 people who have guided me at the university. It's my academic supervisor who guided me at the university, Martinovsky Pavel Nikolaevich, and my academic supervisor, Bushenkov Alexander Sergeyevich. Also, I am very grateful to the people who advised me, who supported me, to my colleagues and the managers of Heritage Institute enable me to conduct research. Alexei Yurovich, I am very grateful, and to Boris Nikolaevich, who is unfortunately absent today. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Our work is finished. The session is closed. Thank you, everybody.
Пока